All right, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Let's see. So I think I recognize just about everybody, but if there's anyone new, DevICT is a program that's ran by Make ICT members. Check them out, makeict.org. They're a great community. Our mission, we're a community of developers, and our mission is to educate, empower, and connect developers in the Wichita area. We have a code of conduct that we take very seriously. We're dedicated to a safe and harassment-free experience for everybody. We try to keep the group open to as many people as possible. More about our code of conduct can be found online. Some ways you can get involved. The absolutely best way to be involved in DevICT is to get on our Slack team and chat. We're on there. Someone's on there every day. I can give you an invitation. Seth, Jim, a couple people can give you invites. You can also get on our website and watch past presentations. This is being recorded right now. We record all of our presentations, and then we get them up on the site. They're just on YouTube. Another way to be involved is to donate. Membership is free, and but donations are appreciated because we do have some monthly costs. There's a PayPal button on the website. Another great way is to give a talk. A great way to be involved. Giving a talk really helps you learn on the topic that you want to talk about. If it's something that you're pretty interested in, committing to talk to it in front of potentially 30 people is a good motivator. And there can also be a practice if you want to then take that presentation and refine it and then maybe present it at like a regional or national or international conference or something. That'd be great.
The next 2 months we're going to be doing lightning talks. Yes. So if you want to give a shorter talk, then that's an opportunity.
We have a website, jobs.devict.org, where you can view or post job openings. Some quick shout outs for some of our friends. Make ICT has their Maker Mondays, which are every other Monday. The next one is September 7th at 7 p.m. This is an open event, right? You don't need a membership to go to Maker Mondays. Yeah. So this is like an open event at their location on Douglas. Women Who Code, their next event is September 2nd at 7 p.m. They're doing lightning talks as well. That'll be here. And then on October 8th out in Andover at Butler Community College, they have How to Write Beautiful Code. Open Wichita's next Hack Night is September 10th here at the Labor Party. Let's see, there we go. The Wichita WordPress Meetup Group, which is having a planning session September 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Brahms at 36 and Rock. There's a meeting room there. If you're into WordPress, this group is just getting started, so definitely check them out and get involved. WULUG, the Wichita State Linux Users Group, their next meeting should be September 3rd at WCU in Jabara Room 205. You do not have to be a WCU student to go to that. You just have to be interested in Linux, Unix. All right, so for DevICT events, our tradition is that when we do the presentation, the next day we have lunch somewhere. So tomorrow at 11:30, we're going to be meeting at Tanya's Soup Kitchen right over here in Douglas. I've never been, but I hear it's wonderful. So I'm excited about that. Every Thursday morning at 7 a.m., we have Code and Coffee, which is we just meet at these tables over here. People will work on whatever, personal projects, maybe work if they're boring. I'm just kidding. It starts at 7 a.m., but people will come whenever. Some people will show up around 8 or 9 or whatever. There's usually people here till about 10 or so. So it's kind of like an open house event. We also have our monthly hangout, which is like Code and Coffee, but it's at night. That's every second Tuesday, so like the second Tuesday of the month, from just like 6 to 9 here at the Labor Party. So the next will be September 8th. And yeah, next month we're doing lightning talks, and we need speakers. So if you've never been to a lightning talk event, you just give a presentation that's like maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. Like we put an upper limit. We'll cut you off at 7. But it's just come up here and talk about something for a couple of minutes, something that you think is interesting or like a cool tool that you found or a technique or maybe like a project that you're working on or something like that that you want to share. And it's just a great way to kind of get exposed to a lot of things at once in one evening. But yeah, so we need speakers for that. So if you have any ideas, talk to me or Seth and we'll make sure to get you in the rotation. That'll be the last Thursday of next month, so September 24th. Tonight, Greg will be teaching us how to fan the embers of our web app with Ember, the JavaScript framework. And let's go ahead and give Greg a round of applause.
Can't put that there again. All right. So yes, fanning the embers of your web app. Jim Rice came up with that title for me because I'm not creative enough to do so. I am Greg Bollinger. I've been a software developer for about 15 years. I have a blog that I don't update, and I have a Twitter account that I don't use very much. But you guys are more than welcome to check those out. Most importantly, I am an Ember newbie. Like Jake was talking about, I used this opportunity to learn Ember because I've been wanting to learn it, and just this kind of forced me into it for the most part. So you guys will have questions that I will have no answers for, just up front, right? What's next here? So I promise I have like 2 slides. So real quick, what is EmberJS? It was created by that named Katz, who also created handlebars, and I'll explain why that's quasi-important here in a little bit. It's an opinionated MVC, MVVM front-end JavaScript framework, and it might do that now and again. We have a new projector, and it's working out the kinks, I guess. So basically think Angular, Backbone, etc. Don't ask me to compare Ember to anything like Angular or Backbone. I'm actually doing a little bit of Backbone right now because my current contract requires it. And I've done enough Angular to put it on that section of my resume that's like lies, right? This is what I'm lying about. If you ask me to compare stuff, now I know that there are some Angular people in the room, so feel free, if somebody asks a question, please answer if you have answers to those questions. You'll see some Rails idioms within Ember. Most of the Ember contributors are big Rails people. So especially with the routing and things like that, you'll see some very similar patterns if you already know Rails. And then the EmberJS.com is the main website, guides, cookbooks, API, and I'll show you guys a little bit of information on that later because their docs are actually pretty decent. And then kind of the best place to Ember help is Stack Overflow with the EmberJS tag. So if you guys need help with Ember, that's usually the best place to go. They say you can go to their IRC channel and stuff like that, but nobody ever responds there. Do they? Okay. They even say on their website, Stack Overflow is the best place to get answers to questions. So, so we're going to be talking about Ember 1.13.7, even though 2.0 is current stable, because halfway through me preparing for this, they released 2.0, and it's changed enough that I didn't want to go through the pain of an upgrade process, etc. Which it's not terrible, but it's a significant difference between 1.13 and 2.0. And yes, a live demo is coming, and you get to watch me copy and paste code because I can't talk and code. I can sing and code at the same time, oddly enough. Cannot talk and code at the same time. So for this particular demonstration, I decided that I was going to be all fancy and create Board Game Geek 2.0. If you guys don't know what Board Game Geek is, it's a big website about board games. That's ambitious. And I didn't recreate that. But I did create something that shows you some games, and you can add games, and you can add games to your own collection, and some other things just to kind of show off the benefits of Ember and some of the key parts of it. So the first step, obviously, when you use anything, is you need to install stuff. And let me make that bigger. So Ember is pretty easy to install using the Node Package Manager install Ember CLI, and then that's how you create a new app, which I'll demonstrate here in a little bit. And the reason that we're going to install Ember CLI is because you can download Ember as JavaScript files, and you can open up a JS file, and you can create all your code in one big JS file. And what Ember CLI will actually turn your code into one big JS file, but it's not structured. It's not a good idea. There's no patterns there. It's just, and finding stuff is ridiculous. EmberCli, what it does is basically gives you a Rails app type structure to work with, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. There is an EmberCli website that's specifically about EmberCli, and it's got its own user guide because there are some things that it discusses that the Ember website does not really touch on in terms of using the Ember command line interface specifically. And it's just embercli.com. And then just another quick note, you don't have to install this, but Ember's main asset pipeline is Broccoli. So all of the JavaScript and CSS minification and all that stuff is going to be handled by Broccoli, and I'll show you that configuration file in the Ember app when we get there and how that kind of works. But those are the main things. You've got your Ember, which is basically just JavaScript. You've got the EmberCli, which is command line tool, and then it's basically backed by Broccoli. But there's also Bower and Grunt and all that stuff that's kind of supplied with it. So if we go over here real quick, so I already created a BGG-talk for tonight, but just to kind of show you, this is basically what you would do to create a new Ember app, and it's going to start doing the whole installing packages for tooling by NPM thing. Oh, yep. You guys see that better? Okay. I'm going to kill this because that takes a little bit of time because it's downloading the internet. What you end up with is, I'm going to actually go over here. You end up with a structure like this, which I wonder if I can. Aha, yes, there it is. So this is the basic structure of an EmberJS application. The only thing I added here was this snippets.txt. It's not part of the structure because I have some code I will copy and paste from that. But basically you have your configuration files. All of the actual structure for the actual application is under the app folder. And we'll start delving into what all those mean whenever we get to the writing the code part. This is basically the Broccoli configuration file I was talking about. So this is where you're going to add imports for additional CSS and JavaScript libraries that you may need that are external from what Ember provides, which isn't really much. I mean, it's basically providing the necessities for Ember, which is HTML bars. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But handlebars and jQuery, because there's still a dependency on jQuery until a later version of 2.0, and things like that. And you can actually see those. Let's see, I think it's in this one. That's basically what Ember is pulling in for its dependencies right now. So on with how all this awesome stuff works. So Ember always starts with an app.js, and EmberCli creates all this awesome code for you already, so you don't have to worry about it. I don't think I will touch this file for this demo at all because it does everything I need it to do from the get-go. It has a root index.html file, which is basically just the structure of the page itself. We won't touch this either because any additional code that needs to be pulled in here in terms of JavaScript or CSS, the command line interface will add it to vendor CSS, and it will add it to vendor.js, as well as any custom CSS or JavaScript that I write will get added to these BGG-talk and BGG-talk CSS and JavaScript files. So unless you want to change the structure of your main HTML page, you probably won't have to touch that much either. Routers. So this is kind of the main entry point for learning Ember, and the reason for that is because Ember took the approach that routers are the most important part of a web application, because web applications are all about routing pages from one page to another. One of the big differences between Ember and some other ways of managing content in MVCs, especially on the server side, most server-side frameworks you guys might understand, MVC-wise, the controllers are responsible for grabbing data and forwarding that onto the view. In Ember, all that's done by the routers. The routers gets the data because you're saying, I want to go to this route. It needs data, it pulls it into the data. Your controllers are dumb in the sense that they're created for you if you don't create them, just enough that there's a controller running in the background that Ember uses under the hood. But you can create a controller to do things like manipulate the data in the model or computer properties and various things like that. And I'll show you some of that whenever we get in here a little bit. But the first thing we want to do is we want to run this. So the way you run an app for development purposes is you type Ember, which is the command line interface, and serve. I haven't done this yet on this test project, so we'll see if this works okay. Uh-oh. Do I have the other one running? Hang on. I might have the other one running. I do. Now this will work. So what this is going to do is basically live reload. It's using Watcher under the hood, so it's actually going to refresh the browser anytime we save another page or anything as well, and you'll kind of see that happen. Any errors that you encounter, it's running JSLint, so it's going to pick up missing semicolons or various things like that and warn you about those, but it'll also display some pretty useful error messages in here if you screw things up really badly. So now that that is running, we'll flip. Oh, I gotta shrink down again here. Localhost. And again, I can't talk and do this at the same time, but I spelled localhost wrong. I did. Okay. Woo, that is fancy. Welcome to Ember, right? So this is basically the entry point to the Ember application, and you can see that if I increase this again. So everything that you're going to view is in the templates. The main template that you're seeing is actually the application.hbs file. And again, these are handlebars. It's actually, so the guy that created Ember also created handlebars. They customized handlebars to support some better two-way binding and various things like that. And then this guy named Eric Brine came in and decided that handlebars was too slow, because basically what happens is when you render handlebars as a template, it turns it into a string of text before it goes into the DOM. So once it goes from the template to the string, they lose concept of anything that was rendered as HTML. What HTML bars does is it actually creates DOM fragments from the template, so they can retain references to the DOM elements as well as better binding, and it's faster because they don't have to do as much string manipulation in the process. So this is the 1.13 Ember is using a version of HTML bars that isn't fully complete yet, but in 2.0 and on, they're continually improving it, so it's more in the line where it should be. So what you're seeing is the welcome to Ember, and in this page, any routes that we go to, if we wanted to go to a different page, view a different page or a different form or a different URL basically in the app, it's going to leave this page alone, but it's going to shove everything into that handlebars mustache markup there called outlet. And the default is outlet with no name. It's going to put everything in there. You can name outlets, which I'll demonstrate later, but they can take on names, so you can specify which outlet you want to render to. But by default, everything's going to go into the outlet. So one thing we want to do real quick to kind of get this going is, like any good back-end developer that I am, we take Bootstrap and we pretend we're front-end developers. So we're going to switch over here and kill this. And the way we get Bootstrap into our project is we run something like, and I got to look at my notes here so that I can remember how to do it. We want to do a Bower install say Bootstrap. So that's going to throw the latest version of Bootstrap into our application. It's showing you that it does have a dependency on jQuery, which is already there, so that's okay. And you can see how that got pulled in if we go look at the Bower.json. Now we have Bootstrap. So in order for us to actually use that in our app now, we do have to modify one file. And I will go to my snippets, I think. Find if it's actually in this one or if it's in a different one. I put it in a different one, so give me just a second. Nope, nope, nope. This. All right, so all these imports here that have something to do with, let me make this bigger again. All right, so right in here, we're going to paste this in. So basically, we are telling Ember to import the well, actually we're telling Broccoli, to import the Bootstrap.js, the CSS map, the CSS. These weird things down here with the fonts. The way that Broccoli and Ember handle assets is with absolute paths, and for this weird reason, because of the way Bootstrap packages things, I have to also tell it to import those as well so it can find the glyph icons and stuff like that. So most of the time, any other assets like this that you install from Bower, you'll basically add as imports to this application, and then these will get added to the vendor.js file whenever everything compiles. Generally, you don't have to stop the Ember server whenever you're making changes. It watches almost everything, but because we had to use Bower and everything, I wanted to go ahead and kill it and restart it. So we'll start it back up, and we'll go back over here, and we'll shrink down again, and we'll refresh. And yep, it still looks the same because we still need to add basically some Bootstrap stuff. And this will actually get added to our application.abs, and we're just going to replace everything that's in here. So basically all I did was I added a nav bar, and it's got some links that will turn into Ember links in a little bit later. But notice I still have my outlet, and it's down here in the container fluid. So if we save that and we just switch right back over to here, then something didn't work, so I need to find out why it didn't work. Because it's live, so why would it work? So anytime I show this console, you're going to see a lot of these yellow deprecation warnings because a lot of stuff was deprecated. 1.13 moved to 2.0. It's just warnings. It doesn't really hurt anything. All right, let me find out why this decided not to work. That's not what I want. Well, let me make sure I didn't do anything wrong down here. And make sure that my Bower components are actually here. Bootstrap, based, blah, 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 JS fonts. All right, let me go look at one other thing to make sure I did all this right. I did. Oh yeah, I haven't bought Sublime Text either. That'll pop up quite a bit. Yep. Not yet. That doesn't have anything to do with Bootstrap. I'm really actually at a loss as to why this isn't working right now. So let's take a look at this. Let me go check one more thing here. Nope. Nope, that's the same. All right, well, you know what we'll do? We will that is what it should look like if it was to work. So I'll tell you what we'll do for now is we will walk through the code that I know works, because obviously the live demo stuff isn't working as to plan, which is pretty typical. So right now we basically have, this is the index page, like I said, it's basically got the Bootstrap markup on it and everything like that. So the first thing we want to do is let's go talk about a route. And to make this simpler so I don't confuse you guys too terribly much. I'm going to go ahead and just X that out right now. So I'm going to add this first route. Actually, that's not going to work. It's going to complain if I do that. So let's just ignore everything below this. So this is basically how you define the simplest of routes, and this is going to define the route to the About page. So note that the route is named About. Ember uses convention over configuration like most MVC frameworks these days. So if we go look at the templates, and we have a matching about.hbs. So that's how it knows this route belongs to this template. And if you're not doing anything on that page, then you don't need anything else defined. You don't have to define the controller. There's an actual route object that you can define, which we'll look at in a little bit. You don't have to define that because Ember will create it for you, kind of like Angular does that, right? So if we go back over here and we click on this, now we see the URL has changed and we're on the About page. But the page didn't actually refresh. It just did the cool little replacement of the outlet thing. The way you wire up that URL, if we go look at this, is with the HTML bars or handlebars helper, the link to, and let me make this bigger. So we link to the About route, and then everything else is just typical markup for that. You can add classes in here. You can pass basically any of the HTML attributes into that helper that you want. HTML bars comes with a ton of helpers for inputs and various things like that, which again we'll see in a little bit. So that's the very, very basics of how a route works, and that's how you build a link to that route. A more complicated route would be, now what we want to do is we actually want to go view all the games. And I'm going to do something real quick just to make sure that everything is reset here, because we're actually using local storage to save stuff. I'm going to make sure it's cleared before I do all this. All right. So if we go back to the home page, this is the same. I'm going to click on all the games. So what this is going to do is it's going to display a list of the games that we have stored in local storage. So we have Alchemist, Trail, House on the Hill, and Rattle Battle, Grab the Loot. So the way this is working is, again, we have a route called games, because this is where we're going to go get all the games. Ignore the sub route for a little bit. And in order to go grab the games, we actually need a route defined for that. So the way that this will work is, again, convention, but since we've opened this up and defined the sub route underneath, it's going to want a directory structure for game. So if we open up games here, let me zoom in. Now we have an index.js. So the main route name for any given route is going to be index if it's subpackaged like this. So if we go to index, all we have to do here is we export a default Ember route. So we're basically extending the existing Ember route object, and we are passing back a model which returns a promise. Ember uses the ES6 module syntax, and some of the EmberJS guys are on the standard team for HTML and all that stuff with web components and HTML5 and everything. So they're trying to kind of stay as current and aligned with that as they can in terms of their API and their syntax. So a route is defined basically, again, extending the route and returning a promise that is the model. This is called a model hook. If you look at the documentation, I'll refer to the model hook. That's what this is. And then we're returning all the games. And I'll kind of discuss what this store stuff is. We could very simply have replaced the store with this. And then games. Because all it wants is an array of JSON. If we go back here, it complains because I've got an unexpected token somewhere, which is blocked. love live demos. They always go exactly as planned, don't they? Oh, I bet I have a, I bet I know what problem this. I think I have an apostrophe in that code, so we're gonna ignore that for now. Anyway, if I didn't have errors in my code, then it would actually still return the same thing. What this store.find is doing, so there's another API that Ember uses called EmberData. They're separate projects, and for a long time they weren't aligned with each other. EmberData was behind, it was considered beta. Their website would actually say, don't use EmberData in production. Now it's finally caught up. Their versions are aligning after the 2.0 mark, and they are saying that it's fine for production now. You don't have to use EmberData. One of the big Ember projects out right now is the Discourse, which is the new forum software that's out. It runs on Ember. They don't use EmberData at all. They just return JSON promises with jQuery for everything. So the only thing that matters is in the model hook, you just need to return the data that you need to return to the front end. It doesn't matter where you get it.
Is that always been expected?
Yes. Yep, always. So let me go back over here. So basically what's happening is, again, we're finding all the games, and I'm going to talk about the model in a minute, returning all the games to the front end, and I'll show you how we list those. So again, because of the directory structure, because of the way we defined our route, under the templates we have games and we have index. So again, everything's matching up, the index route with the index template. Now if we look up here at the top, right here is where we are listing all the games. So HTML bars, helpers with each tag for each model as game. So anytime a route returns data to the view, and it still goes through the controller even though the controller's not there, it's going to return it as model. So the model that we're getting back for each of the games in the model as game, we're looping over that, and then we're pulling out the game image, game title, and some more helper links, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then there's also a game description, but we're not showing it on this page. And that's how it's looping over that data that it got back. That also relies on a model. So anytime you want to persist data with EmberData, you need a model to do so. So we have a game model. You basically extend the model object and you give it its properties. Most of the time, ds.attribute would be enough. Sometimes with dates and various things like that, you need to be more specific about what kind of attribute it is. But in our case, we're just basically dealing with a bunch of strings. So it was easy enough to just do the ds.attribute. ds is just the imported shortcut for EmberData with the ES6 or EC6. ES6?
Yes.
ES6. Yeah, ECMAScript, right. So it's just short coding how to access that data. And then Ember wraps all, it's basically an active record model just like Rails. Like I said, you'll see a lot of Rails idioms in this. So you define the model and then you've got all the save and the gets and all that stuff just built into it from EmberData. It also supports relationships. So we'll hear in a little bit, we'll talk about owned games, but basically a game belongs to, or a game belongs to or an owned game belongs to a game. So it supports has many, many, has one, all the different relationships as well, and all that stuff's just built in for pushing data onto the collection and various things like that. But I didn't want to focus a whole lot on EmberData because it could be a whole other talk. But I just needed to give an example of it because we needed to use it for the actual application. So again, we have the route defined in the routing. In the routes, we have the route object, we have the model object, and then we have the view wiring up, displaying this list right here. Any questions about that so far? It's a little more confusing like this because if I was actually live coding through it, it would be a little bit easier to follow, but I don't want to deal with all the issues that I would probably deal with in that process like I already did. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the MVC model. The cool thing too, though, is that that model hook is being observed. So when we, here in a little bit, when we start adding more data, we'll save the data into EmberData, into the model itself, into the collection, and then this page will magically update itself with the new data. It won't go fetch it from the database again or anything like that. It basically just says, hey, this collection has changed. You're displaying this collection. I'm observing that. I'm going to show you new stuff. And we can actually talk about that right now. But I want to get into controllers a little bit. So we have this add game button down here. And what the add game button does is it basically hides and shows this little form down here for adding a new game. So in order for that to work, I had to build a controller for this particular route. And the reason for that is because the controller is basically going to handle the majority of your actions that happen from the page, whether it's saving data from a form, which we'll show in a little bit, or it's pressing other buttons or links or things that you want to happen. So if we go look at that, controllers, and again, we have games and we have index. So we will simply look at, we have this is adding game property that's part of the controller. We basically extend the controller object. Ember up through this version had concept of array controller, object controller, collection controller, various things like that. Dumping all that because it was too confusing. And they're actually moving away from controllers. They're making routable components instead of using controllers for the majority of what people normally use controllers for. But controllers, top-level controllers like this are still going to be fully supported through the whole 2.0 line. So if you had code like that before, you wouldn't have to go back and change it. The only thing you'd have to get rid of is the object controllers and array controllers, which is a matter of I want to manage collections or I want to manage an object. I think Angular has a similar concept to that, don't they?
But, well, in Angular, like your models are just however you define it, they don't really define it for that. So
But if you define a controller in Angular?
it doesn't type models.
Okay.
It just
Gotcha.
basically defines the area of the page that logic controller would be responsible for. It's not tied to a route.
I got you. Okay.
It can be.
I got you. Okay. Anyway, back to this. So we basically added a property on the controller called isAddingGame, and we set it to false by default because, you know, when we came into the page, that form wasn't showing. When the add game is clicked, this function is getting called, and it's just a toggle is all it's doing. It's setting the isAddingGame to the opposite of whatever isAddingGame is right now. And because everything's observed and because of the binding, if we go look at this, this. So here's the button that does that. So the action is add game, so that was the name of the function we gave it. And then I also added these if-else in here. So if it's adding a game, it should say cancel add game. Otherwise, it's just going to say add game. So this button is being observed, and that action is being observed, and it's part of the binding process where when you click that, then it knows that something has changed, so something should change on the page. So it's not like you have to click that button and then tell the code to notify the view to do something. It's doing that for you, which is kind of nice. So again, that's how that gets triggered from that controller. So another thing we can do in the controller is we can actually save a new object. So if we go look at that code real quick, we have a simple form down here with inputs. The inputs are using the HTML helper templates. And the way the binding works with these helpers is based on the value. So when you give it a value equals whatever the name is, then it's going to send that data back through the route into the controller, through the controller's model hook, which you don't have to necessarily know about, other than it's there. Same with description, same with image, and then the button action is actually calling new game. You don't even really need a form declaration for this to work because it's the button that's triggering the action itself, not the form. I need the form because that's the way that Bootstrap forms work. But notice it doesn't have an action or anything like that. So if we go look at that code in the controller, you can see that it's very simple. We're getting the title and the description and the image because the binding actually binds the properties back to the controller. And then if any of those are blank, we're just returning false. I'm not displaying any error messages right now or anything like that. And then we're creating a new record. This is Ember data. So when you create a new record for Ember data, call create record, you give it the name of the model that you're trying to persist, and then you populate its properties, resetting the form in a very inefficient fashion because I'm sure there's some fanciful way to do this. And then inevitably, we're actually saving the game back to the store. For the sake of this demo, all of the assets for the images are underneath public assets images. So anything you need is public assets. This is where they go in an Ember application. I have some images already there, so I didn't have to deal with file uploads because that's a little bit more complicated than what I wanted this topic to be because of the whole Ajax file uploading stuff. So if we go back here, I should be able to just say, Predator, this is a really hard game to win, and I'm pretty sure that this is the JPEG, and hit save. And of course, I entered the wrong image name, so we'll do it again. Hey, there we go. So there you can see it just the binding of the model to the route and to the controller. Once the model's collection was notified, hey, you've got a new object, Ember knows that this view is actually displaying those, so it needs to add it to that collection and render it on the page. And it's actually smart enough to not re-render the whole collection. So it doesn't re-loop through everything and redraw everything. It actually only puts on the screen what it needs to put on the screen. The old version, when it was just with handlebars, actually would redraw portions of the screen in this case because they would lose the DOM altogether anytime they would change the template to a string. But with HTML bars, it's a lot more efficient that way. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay. So the next thing we'll talk about is we will talk about my collection. So again, this is very similar to showing a list of games, so I'm not going to go in detail through this part of the code. But if we click over on my collection, it does show that I own the Alchemist game. It's a separate model, which is defined right here. It's called owned game. And it's very simple. It doesn't have any other properties other than it belongs to a game. But in order, if you notice on this page, I do have how many of these games I own. So the way this works is through a computed property. And the reason that they're computed properties is you could actually go into the router or the model itself, and you could define some sort of property to combine first name, last name, etc. But they wouldn't be observed. So when that collection changes or that model changes, that computer property wouldn't trigger to say, update me. So in order for that to work, we do have a collection controller because this route is actually on the collection route. And the way that computer properties work in Ember, again, we extend the controller and we've defined a collection total, and we've told it it's a computed property of each model. We get that particular model that's being computed, and it knows that because of the name of the collection and the route and how everything's tied up. And then we just return the length property of that computed property.
What's the purpose of the model.add?
So I've asked that question a lot of times from people, and nobody can really explain it to me. What's basically happening is internally, Ember's looking at that and saying, you're trying to access multiple copies of this model, so iterate over that with the at each in order to get the computer property.
So maybe it's either that or like model.1 set. So
right.
It's just computed off of this.
Yeah.
Is that maybe a way to allow it to notify things, keep everything in sync with the two-way binary?
That's possible, but I don't know for sure. I asked on Stack Overflow and I asked somewhere else, and I got kind of an answer, but it wasn't anything more than what I've said here as to how that really works under the hood internally. But the way we render that is if we go back down, so we do have a collection template that is looping over. I'm going to talk about components in a minute. But up here, you can see we're basically just saying, grab me the collection total. So it knows go to collection total in the controller and pull me back whatever that number is and display it on the screen. And if that were updated on this page itself, you would actually see that counter would increase or decrease if we were to add and remove items from the collection. So one of the big things with Ember is components. And they're actually, like I said, they're actually making components one of their core pieces of the infrastructure with 2.0 on, and with routed components. Components you can think of, especially under the hood with HTML bars, they're basically web components. So they're following that spec, and eventually in the 2.0 line, they're actually going to change the component markup to be angled brackets instead of the handlebars templates or HTML bars templates. So they're going to really be more like web components because they really believe that's the future of things. And the way that components work is kind of strange, but they expect them to have, you can either put it in a directory structure or you can actually just name it component / whatever the name of the file is. And it has to have dashes in it. It can't just be a name without a dash. It has to be a dashed name. So underneath here, you can see that we have a game detail small HBS, and it's under the component directory. And it's basically just what you see here, the very simple markup of showing this box on the screen. And it also has a link to, and if we go back to the collections.hbs, you can see that we are looping over each owned game, and we're passing that as the model into the component. So this is the simplest form of a component you can create. The only other thing it requires is an actual component here, just to extend it. It doesn't have to do anything, but for the component to work, this component, you just have to extend the base component object. I have another component that's a bit more complex than this that'll make use of extending the component object itself, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. But that's like I said, that is the simplest form of a component that you can have, is basically just markup that you reuse and slap it on the screen somewhere and pass data to it. It's not that different than your typical includes with various other backend languages and stuff. So let's go back over here, and we will go back to all the games. So another thing that you can do on this page is you can actually add a game to your collection. So if we go ahead and we just click this button, we have a little flash message that shows up. If we go back over to my collection, now we have both those games in my collection. And again, the way that works is we're back in the games index, and right down here we have a button that is calling an action called add to game or add to collection, and we're passing it the ID of the game that we want to add to our collection. So anytime you have an action, you can actually pass it multiple attributes. I could do space, and I could put a string in here called hello, and this will basically determine how many variables you need to pass into your function for that particular action. We don't need to do that, so I'm going to get rid of that. And if we go back up to the controller, that's not the controller, we can see add to collection, and it's taking one argument, which is the game ID, which you saw that we were passing in. I'll talk about flash messages in a little bit. So basically, we're creating a new record called owned game. And then what we're doing here is something a little bit different than we normally would on a find, but we're using promises here especially. We're going out, and because of the way that JavaScript executes, if I didn't use this as a promise and I tried to basically create this and then do the flash message, it would happen in the wrong order because it kind of just goes, and then all the other asynchronous stuff happens, and it may not come back with it yet. This is really fast because we're just dealing with local storage, but still there was a delay enough that it wasn't working. So it's better to do it this way anyway. So we're going out and finding the game by the game ID. And then with that game object coming back, we set the game on the own game, and we save it, and then we flash the message to the screen. And then because of all the binding and everything, it updates the model. So one thing I want to show you now is a really powerful tool that Ember provides. And this is available for, sorry?
Sorry, just save on the model.
Yes. Yep. So there is a plugin for both, or extension for both Firefox and Chrome. I'm not sure if they developed one for IE or not. But it's basically the Ember tools. I'll zoom in here a little bit. So the cool thing about this is you can go in here and you can view all the routes. So notice there's always got to be an application route because that's your main route into the whole application. And underneath the application route, you can see that we have the games route. You can see the route name. You can see the name of the controller. So if you ever don't know what to name something, you can go here and say, oh, if I want to have a controller for this route, I need to name it games.js under the controller folder. Same thing with a template. If I wanted the correct template, then I know that I need to come down here and find the games index. It even gives you the controller name if you wanted to be specific about that because it's called index under the controller, etc. And then games also has a sub route, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But this, you can see all of your routes. You can even see the data. So if we go in here, we can see the data that's currently being used. We see the games here, and we see the own games. Technically, there's 5 games, but there's something weird about local storage and how this tool works that it's not always 100% accurate. If I went back to all the games, then it's updated to 5. Not entirely sure what's going on there. I looked that up a little bit, but it's a local storage issue. It's not an Ember issue specifically. And you can actually see the data that's associated to the data itself. You can view deprecations. You can view, can I click on this? Oh, there we go. The container, the promises, the rendering performance. So there's just a whole lot of really useful data when you're developing in Ember with this tool. And let me go ahead and kill that real quick. So we've shown a list of games. We added a game to the collection. We added a new game. The other thing that we'll talk about real quick is this really awesome login button that doesn't actually log in, but it gave me an opportunity to show off a little bit more about the components. So if we click this login button, we're basically just shown this modal dialog. It wants a username and password, and we click OK. And if we click OK, we do login stuff. So this will give you a little bit better insight into how components work. So if we go back, again, we've defined a component that we basically called myModel. The reason we could call the component myModel is because we could actually display any content into this modal window that we want. We're displaying a login form for this one, and I'll show you how that works in just a little bit. But we have this new thing here called yield. So the way that yield works is when you're passing data into a template, or when you're passing more HTML basically into a template that you want rendered just as HTML, it will automatically go into this awesome little yield block here. So the way all this works is inside of, where's it at? I'm gonna find it. So we've defined at the root level this login modal that basically has this template wrapped in the myModal, which is, again, when you reference a template, you're referencing it with the HTML handlebars. So we're saying we want to use myModal. This is the title we're going to give it. This is the action we're going to call on login. And this is the action we're going to call on close. And then the form has an action for OK. And its target is the view. And the reason that's important is because it has to know which view that it's associated with actually calling actions for with the controllers behind the scenes. So if you didn't pass it a view, it wouldn't know which one it's talking to because it's a modal, it's sitting on top of everything. It doesn't really, if it's generic enough, it doesn't really know what screen, what view you're on. So you have to tell it which view you're on. And then again, just a typical form. We have a login modal controller. So the login action that gets called is actually being passed into the controller action. And then if we go look at the myModal component JavaScript, this is where the OK action is. This is where the show action is. And you can see that we're basically just showing the model or hiding the model based on everything that happens. So that's a little bit more complex version of how a component works, and it's generic enough that, like I said, if we wanted to create another one called settings modal, it would look exactly like this, except we would pass in the title that we wanted, we would pass in the HTML that we wanted. So all this is what winds up in that yield block on here. And everything else is just basically a template around it. Any questions on that? All right. We're sitting on time. So real quick, last thing I'll talk about, and this is important because there are a lot of, I'll call them Ember plugins for lack of a better term. So you notice that when we clicked on this plus button, we got a little flash message up here. And the way that that works is somebody wrote a library for Ember called EmberCli Flash or something like that. I think it's called, yeah, EmberCli Flash. So Ember comes with a tool for installing Ember specific modules. So if I did this, I'm not going to run it again, but running that actually installed this Ember Flash plugin into Ember. So Ember supports dependency injection. It has a services layer. It has an adapter layer. It has an initializer layer. And the way that the Flash is working is there's a service that gets injected into every controller and every router. So when once we've got that in there, we basically have to go update our EmberCli build to pull in, oh wait, I'll take that back. That's not what I need to look at. That's for the local storage. Hang on. So if we go back into here, when we do Ember get, we pass it the context, which is this controller, and we look up the Flash messages service that got injected. We didn't write the service, that was installed for us automatically whenever we installed it from the Ember command line client. So we get the Flash messages out, and then it has several methods like success, failure, warn, and it basically does the bootstrap markup based on which one you have. And the package is actually written with Bootstrap in mind, so it's not going to work if you're not using, I mean, it'll work if you're not using the Bootstrap library. It just won't look, it won't have the markup correct. So there's a lot of those types of packages out there. There's authentication packages. There's packages for logging in through social networks like Facebook and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. So just a ton of different stuff you can go find. The only thing you have to be careful of is, will they work with whatever version of Ember you're working with? Since they just released 2.0, some people are going to be catching up. So if you jump on 2.0, which isn't a bad idea, you just may have less of those plugins to actually work with as people are trying to catch up. And one other quick note, just out of interest, if you guys want to see this. This is the JavaScript that is being generated by the EmberCli. It winds up in this one big file, so you can see that the application adapter is being defined here. If we go down and find, yeah, yep. We can go down here and see that here's basically, I mean, you guys saw this exact code. It was just wrapped differently in the way that it was being defined because it was using the module syntax. Here's the games index being defined with its actions. So the nice thing is that you deploy this out to production somewhere, and if you can do a production build using the EmberCli, and it's going to minimize some stuff. But you can also do a production build without minimizing, and if you do that, you're basically looking at this. So if you deploy something and something's not working, but it's working locally, digging in here and trying to figure out why isn't this working, it's, you know, you can kind of tell what's going on. You'll be able to look at this and say, I know where that is at in my Ember structure. I can go look at it when you're looking at it in the console. I had some other notes here. I just wanted to make sure I talked about stuff. Talked about that. Yep. Okay, I talked about all that, so that's good. And that is basically it. The only thing now is if we go back here, so Embers, like I said, their docs are really good. They started out not as great just because it was hard to keep up. They were doing a lot of releases. They've gotten really good at it now. The community is really getting back in here. You can actually go all the way back to version 1.10 and view that specific documentation. So that was kind of came in handy. They released 2.0, and I'm like, I got to get to my 1.13 documentation, and it's still there. The guides are really good at basically explaining, there's lots of examples explaining how everything works. And then the API is kind of the same way. There's a lot of really good information. So if I wanted to go learn about the, where's a good thing to look at here? The Ember object, for example, which is kind of the base object for everything. It's a typical API, but it's done really well. It's coming back in a minute. Okay. And then you can basically click into these, and a lot of times they'll have very good descriptions on here and even some examples of how things work. So I spent a lot of time in here in the model documentation, the router documentation, the controller documentation, just trying to figure out how things all work together. And everything with the documentation now is also built around using EmberCli. So you'll see the ES6 syntax with the module syntax and various things like that. Whereas you don't have to write it like that. You could write it like the compiled JavaScript I showed you. But it's a lot easier just to go to the EmberCli route because that's kind of what they're promoting now. In fact, they used to have a package you could download that was basically a skeleton Ember app with all the JavaScript files and everything that you could just start there and open up the app.js and start writing everything in there, the controllers, models, and everything. They don't even present that on their website anymore. They're just like, use EmberCli. So I would recommend definitely just starting out with that. And again, there's documentation on that on the EmberCli website. And I didn't copy and paste a lot, but you know. So Ember 2.0, I talked about some of these things as we were going through. Not only have controllers largely been eliminated because of routable components, but they basically have removed views. So we didn't talk about views because I didn't need to use any. But views kind of used to be this better way of doing components. It's probably more similar to views, how views are used in Backbone and maybe even Angular, because Angular have a views concept. Seth?
Do they have? Yeah.
They do?
It's more of templates.
Okay.
But if you use the router, it's still called templates there.
Because views here would be JavaScript files that would support logic running behind a specific template, basically. But they've basically said that's too confusing. We really like components. We're moving to routable components. It's better isolation, scoping semantics, and it fulfills, they say, I copy and pasted this. It fulfills the use cases views were introduced for. So no views in 2.0. Like I said, controllers have largely been eliminated. They still support the top level controllers for a while. You know, we'll see how long that lasts. They did drop IE8 support in 2.0, which yay. And Ember data versions are aligned with the Ember versions, and then they're moving to the angle bracket components instead of the handlebars mustache markup, because basically they want to get them really, really close to as close to web components API as they can. And I'll put this online somewhere and send a link, but that has the full details of the 2.0 release, which has a lot more information in here than this, but since I didn't cover most of the stuff, it wouldn't make a lot of sense, so I didn't put it on here.
It's really interesting that like so many of the things that they're moving towards that's the direction Angular 2 is going.
Yeah.
They dropped controllers, they're trying to focus on components.
One of the cool things about the Ember guys is that they are 100% right tool for the right job, and they fully admit that you might not should use Ember. It depends on what your requirements are. And I think that there's probably a lot of coordination between the various teams and stuff with where things are moving.
They're all learning from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think they all are going to be using a virtual DOM now, which that was React.
Right.
React, that was
Right.
a big deal.
Yep.
It's like, okay, we'll do that.
Yeah, and then they did that with HTML bars.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean Angular 2, not to get too far off topic, I mean I've seen some performance benchmarks between 1 and 2, and they really improved that like big time. Yeah.
And the fact that they did get to the virtual DOM, now they can have, they can hook that virtual DOM representation up to any rendering engine. It's like React did that, and that's what let them do React Native.
Right.
So Angular should be.
Yeah.
That's the plan at least.
Right.
Will you be posting your code?
Yeah, I'll put it up on GitHub. I started a GitHub project back 3 months ago when I said I was going to do this, and then I started pushing stuff on GitHub, and I gave a link in the Slack channel, and then they moved to 2.0, and I was like, I'm not going to try and switch over and everything. So I'll pull that one down, and I will definitely put the code up for this one on GitHub. Yep. Any other questions? Comments?
How much ES6 is in like different versions? Just saw it constants and then modules.
Yeah, it's been fully supported since at least 1.10 and maybe a little bit before. I mean, they kind of, as soon as EmberCli, as soon as they started working on EmberCli, they started moving towards ES6 support, just because they, like I said, they're really big on the standards. And
It uses Babel, right? I think that was.
Yeah.
Babel is supporting ES7 stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, pretty much anything you can think of.
Right. And again, I apologize for the live coding not working out. It would have probably made a little more sense if I was able to do it that way, but that's what happens, and that's, you know, right? So anything else? All right, well, thanks, guys.